Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, we have quite a bit to cover. It's been about a week since our last episode, just over a week. So, we have quite a bit about Ukraine, about tangential news out of Europe, of course, news out of Russia itself, and a little bit on East Asia. So, we'll make the rounds, don't worry. There's plenty to cover in these next couple of hours here. Without further ado, I'll hand it over for the Minutia Minute to GSP.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, there is a lot to cover. We're a week and a day since our last episode. Why don't we start off with the north around Kharkov, and you can see that the area that the Russians control basically hasn't changed since after that first week of August. The Russians in this area are outnumbered 3-1 or 2-1. They're still trying to make some offensive attacks that are basically in between the two red zones that they have captured here. Part of the reason for this is there is a small river that cuts through here. It could, if I'm not mistaken, it could be the Severodonetsk. It's a long, winding river. It's not particularly wide in this area, but it's the infamous river that goes all the way down to Donetsk, um, by that forested area around Kremenaya, roughly around there. And so, if you go to the next slide, this is where we're seeing the absolute heaviest amount of fighting, with a total fog of war almost, as to who is where. The the Russians had it had been reported that the Russians had captured almost the entirety of the northern half of Volchansk, and then reports came in that that was not the case. And what you're looking at is the area that the Ukrainians control. Some of this territory, the Ukrainians managed to recapture from the Russians. Now, um, there's some conflicting reports about the bridges that lead into Volchansk, right? Maybe on the last show that we did, I mentioned that there were two in the west, and that the Ukrainians destroyed and the Russians destroyed about four in the central and eastern side. Military, sorry, history legend did a video on this, and basically saying many of the same points that we and we Union have been saying, which is that this operation is very much a trap. The Russians don't have the force in order to advance any further, but their presence there is in many ways a kind of PR plight on the Ukrainians. And with the upcoming NATO summit in the US, just some weeks away, maybe a month. It's in July. I forget exactly when in July. They can't have this. And you could even argue, because people like Kirby have already hinted at, Ukraine might be able to do some kind of counteroffensive this year. This is basically to sell the idea that Biden is winning in Ukraine, and we should fund Ukraine even more so because they're winning. Like, there's a direct one-to-one relationship. You give money to Ukraine, Ukraine wins. You don't give money to Ukraine, Ukraine loses. It's that simple, right? That reinforces the idea that America is still the hegemon, and America can just throw money at anything, and money is magic, right? Money will make anything happen. It's just a question of how much money. I mean, it's stupid, but it's enough for most people. So I would say that there's a lot of forces that the Ukrainians have diverted into this area. They have completely left the Kherson direction, and we'll get into that, including the 39th Brigade, which was more of a, I think, recently developed brigade in 2023. This might be one of their NATO trained brigades. Anyways, it is now fighting um, in this area of Kharkov. And the 67th, the infamous brigade that abandoned parts of Chasiv Yar, They are here as well, even though I thought they were technically disbanded. I thought this is like the Pravi sector. So, extremely heavy fighting, but the Ukrainians are also very worried in the north about a possible attack by the Russians. They have been, and I said this way back like 3 weeks ago, that the Ukrainians are bombing the Russians with drones, with small drones, first person view drones, and they're not just like electrical areas and places where the Russians store, let's say, gas or oil, but early this week, the Ukrainians basically accomplished a very good attack from a Ukrainian perspective on a convoy of Russian trucks. Now, these trucks were not escorted by armored personnel carriers or tanks or anything else. It was just trucks, and they were struck by FPVs. And now the interesting thing is, instead of remaining static, which is kind of like what the Russians did at the beginning of the war back in 2022, all the trucks start to drive off. Some of them go into farmers' fields, some of them go into the forested areas. Now, all the trucks get it, and I would say, you know, 8 to 10, 11 trucks for sure, based on on the video footage that I saw. There was probably equipment in there, right? And it was going in a region very close to the city of Sumy. Sumy is northeast of Kharkov. Okay, and it's a region where the Ukrainians have launched various drones. It hasn't received the same kind of punishment that Belgorod has, which is, just a few kilometers on the other side of the border of Ukraine, across from Kharkov. But in any case, so this was a very successful strike. The Ukrainians have expanded um, an 8 kilometer radius around the border, even further, going deeper into Ukraine, to evacuate people from these villages, because I think they expect a Russian attack. And if I had to bet, like, when that would be, okay, it would be like, I would say, if the Ukrainians want to be really on the ball, they would. They've moved a lot of forces. Like, the Russians are way are at least 2 to 1, 3 to 1 outnumbered right now. A lot of those weapons that the Americans said would be coming, and have been coming since the first couple of days of May, uh, they're going to go online, and they're going to be in this theater. And what you would want the Ukrainians to do is to definitely begin something that is successful. Let's say no later than, like, I don't know, June 16th, 17th, and there's a crescendo building, and you get into July, and you've successfully pushed back the Russians. That's what you would want. That would sell. Okay, that would sell. However, if at that moment that is happening, and now the Russians are probably getting a better idea of how many reserves the Ukrainians actually have, right? If that's the case, then the Russians then open up another front similar to the one at Kharkov, but also to Sumy. That could get interesting. The thing about Sumy is just northeast of the city. It's a much smaller city than Kharkov, but it is a city. There are expansive forests, and it could be an area where the Russians could entrench themselves for a long time, right? In a similar way that the Russians learned, sometimes the hard way, not to go into Krinky, the town, but to stay in the forest belt around the town, and from there fire into the town where the Ukrainians were. This was in the Kherson front line in the south. Okay, so that's the situation in the north. Let's move slightly east and south and get into the news in the front lines in Kupiansk. Oh, actually, before we do, please go to the second and third slide. This is the town of Lipsy. The Ukrainians are on the move here. They are regaining territory. Um, this correspond those two red patches that you saw at the beginning. This is a smaller patch on the left side. This is an area that the Ukrainians have fought very hard to try to regain this territory. So these are just the slides above the wonderful slide you sent me before the show started. So
Oh yes, of course.
yeah,
Let me just get those up right here because I got them a little out of order, but okay, I have them fixed now, so I'll get that up right there. So we have them up.
okay, perfect. Okay, so then that wraps up Kharkov, and now we can get into Kupiansk. So as you can see, the Russians have gained some new territories in the Kupiansk area. They've bypassed Sinkovka to some degree, and now they're also have begun to expand southeast of this area. Okay, so if you follow the first slide and you follow that contour that goes into the bottom right hand corner, that contour eventually leads to this sort of large square that the Russians have captured. Now, the interesting thing about the fighting in this area, it is extremely bloody for both sides. The Russians did make this big gain, and in this attritional war, what you see on the map there is actually a big gain in one day. But the fighting to stabilize it, this is the area of Ivanovka. The Russians captured Ivanovka last week. The week before, they captured Kislovka and Kotlyárovka, and they also captured Tabayevka, which I think came earlier. But this area that you see north of Ivanovka, okay, um, very heavy fighting. The kind that you're going to see a lot of gruesome stuff. Both sides absolutely brutalizing each other. And what the Russians want to do with this area is they want to bypass directly, go north, and then in a pincer movement get to that town that you see there named Stepova Novoselovka. Okay, Stepova Novoselovka is you can see it's very close to one of the roads, and eventually what the Russians will want is to gain control of this road, because this road eventually leads to Kupiansk, where you saw the first slide of the new territories that the Russians have gained there. So why don't we now go to Chasiv Yar? So you can see what's happened since last week. The Russians have expanded their control uh, in Ivanovska. I know there's a lot of these names are almost exactly the same. Ivanovka, Ivanovska, like they're just the slightest differences.
It's
Uh,
just pure petty spite on the part of the Ukrainians. These names. There's not really any other way to put this. That they just add some e sounds and draw them out. So I don't know. Maybe it's even Niske, just to clarify that we're saying the Ukrainian version, kind of like Kiev or Lviv or what. Once again, they like to e is it's
it's
obnoxious. It's
I
obnoxious.
I still remember. Okay, so like when I grew up, uh, you know, in Toronto in the East End, I would see places that that were Slovenian. There was a place called Slovenski Dom, Makedonski Dom, Srpski Dom, right? It's always Dom, home. Okay, that it means home. I remember when I saw the Ukrainian one in the like, it's kind of in the central, slightly west, but mostly central area. It's moved since then. I think Harry Krishna's bought it like 15 years ago or 20 years ago. Anyways, it was called Ukrainsky Dim. I'm going, what? Dim? What? Anyways, God love him. Anyhow, so it's just the way they say it. So you can see here in Chasiv Yar, the big thing that is happening more so than the territory that's been gained in the right, although that helps them, it helps the Russians expand their control towards Klishevka, which is what is there beneath that new territory that they took. But if you look at the north in Kalinina, or as the Ukrainians call it, Kalinininka, Well, I'm going to just call it Kalinina. So that territory has now moved right against the the canal. Okay, the left side of that territory that's been gained at the top, that's a canal that goes through there, and there is also a pipe. Remember the pipe system that we saw in Avdiivka, and the Russians went behind enemy lines about a kilometer and a half, popped out on the other side. So this canal also has a pipe system. It's above ground. It's not underground. At least the video footage that I saw. Now the pipe system follows the route, the path of the canal. So it's not like it goes east-west. It goes mostly north-south. So it's more of a defensive barrier than it is actually like a way to appear on the other side of the enemy, like going behind enemy lines and surprising them. So that is um, so if we go to the next slide, which is more of a bird's eye view, but I want to draw your attention to that area of Kalinina. So the interesting thing that happened in Kalinina, and I hope I can find the image for it. Okay, maybe this will work. Okay, I'm going to send you a slide. Okay, because there's an interesting story about this. This particular slide does not. Maybe it doesn't even. Well, okay, so just the latest slide that I sent you, that's Kalinina. So uh, there's a famous sort of footage now of the Ukrainians, sorry, the Russians, in a armored personnel carrier, driving along this road in Kalinina, and going basically to the cross section. This green area that has been taken. If you follow where the western leftmost tip is, the Russians even went further than that. They basically went into that crossroads. There were trenches everywhere, and in no place did they encounter any kind of resistance because all the trenches were empty, except for one or two FPV drops. Nothing really happened, and the video cuts out with the armored personnel carrier going even further west. Um, so, Dima of the uh, history, what is it? No,
Military summary.
military summary channel does have. I just sent it to you now. Does have video footage to confirm what I'm talking about. You can see that that area that the Russians captured in Kalinina, the rightmost, the one in the more intense red on the left, in the left half corner area, that's the trench network that I'm talking about. And I'm a fool because I can't find the photo that has like the area where they went in. Weeb Union's channel had it, but nonetheless, what you're seeing here that Dima has provided is there's video footage that suggests the Ukrainians in this pocket were surrounded and they made an attempt to escape. One video footage shows a lone Ukrainian trying to escape, the other one a Bradley, and in both cases they were destroyed. And so what they were trying to do is cut across. A lot of people interpreted that as they had control over this area, but that's not the case. So the Russians have made quite the headway into Chasiv Yar, as you can see. And then if we move back up in the slides that I sent you and go to the area just on the slide above where it says Avdiivka, that will give the viewers a close-up bird's view of basically the area of the micro district. This is just south of the area that we've been talking about. Um, You can see that the Russians have expanded their control in the micro district of Chasiv Yar. Okay, so they're basically doing a pincer movement. Kalinina is the area we were talking about. That's in the north, and in the south, where the piping system is, the Russians have already crossed over the canal. So, Chasiv Yar could be kind of like the next city that falls or the next town that falls in Ukraine before 2024 is done. And once that happens, the Russians will now have the highest peak in all of Donbass. So it will be a very critical moment. So why don't we then go to Avdiivka? And you can see that the gains that the Russians have made here. So we can begin with the first slide. So you see a lot of gains north of Ochertina and Arkhangelsk, just northwest of Arkhangelsk. And the next slide shows a close-up of that which was taken. This is only a few days ago that the Russians took this. This is on higher ground, and you can see it has a small, it's getting close to a small fortification before some of the larger fortifications to the right of it. Let's go to now the third slide. This has an interesting video. The Russians just took this territory today. It's not huge, but this is a very contested area. And I believe the name of this area is Sokol. So it almost didn't happen, but Sokol, as you can see, has a well-fortified area just north of it. Now, take a look at the fortifications around this area of the Ochertina-Avdiivka front. And you'll notice that they're very big, complex fortifications. A lot of these fortifications they're not trench works for defense. They are trench works and clearings with walls basically for firing positions. In other words, this is where artillery would be stored. I'm not saying it's true for all of them, but it would be for most of them. So that's probably also the case for the fortification north of Sokol, where the Russians have just captured it. So now we can zoom in on Sokol. And this was, yes, the next slide. So this was completely crazy, the way this happened. The Russians have an armored personnel carrier with a Cope cage, and the Ukrainians have a Bradley, and they're on the same road. And the Bradley starts to open fire just as the Russian personnel carrier drives by it on its left side. The armored personnel carrier has men on top, men inside, so I'm sure this thing is just stuffed. It speeds along, and at least I could see in the video one of the men fall off, and it's not a nice fall. You can see him crawling away. Anyways, this thing comes to a grinding halt. All the guys jump out and jump off. And that is how they got this territory. The Bradley eventually got hit after it went further east and then decided to turn back towards Sokol. So, I mean, just, the old adage, those crazy Russians. I mean, that was just insane. It was like, just, how sometimes they make me so crazy. I Okay, so what other fronts should we talk about? You saw well, let's go with this one. This is going to become an important battle. This comes courtesy of Scott from Scott Calibrated. This is the area that the Russians have been fighting for since the last week. Many of these green areas were just captured in the last 48 hours. Possibly 72 hours. And you can see at the very top, that green area, the Russians just recently recaptured Pobeda. Pobeda was an area that the Russians captured. They didn't capture any, like, it was just a thin salient, and the Ukrainians kept um, counterattacking, and they eventually regained Pobeda, and I would say that would have been in early May, and then the Russians, well, I mean, sorry, somewhere in April, then the Russians regained it last week, maybe at least 5 days ago. So the important thing about this is, okay, so Novomihailovka was a town that the Russians captured, I believe, back in March. And, for a while, this area kind of went dormant. And some of the other videos, episodes that we've done, we've said that, this area is close to another town named Konstantinovka. And Konstantinovka has a highway called the 00532. And that highway leads directly into Ugledar. Okay. So all these green advances, you can tell that the Russians want to get to this highway. They eventually want to take Ugledar. The Russians have re-begun fab bombing Ugledar. They've not advanced with anything, but they are destroying it to rubble, essentially, right? And the other thing that happened this week is the Russians captured Parskoyevka. So Parskoyevka is a tiny village wedged between Konstantinovka and Novomihailovka. It's the second green area that you see there. The other ones are just the farmers' fields. There are no towns there. There are some fortifications, but no towns. So that's another important area that's developing because Ugledar has been a bone of contention, and some people have speculated that if you capture Ugledar, you can make a very profound effect on the rest of, let's say, on the rest of the Zaporozhye Southern Front. Okay, so oh, there it is. Okay, this no, never mind. We've gone over it a zillion times. It's okay, just ignore me. So the next area I wanted to bring up was the Vermevsky Ledge. The area where there's the town of Staromayorska and Urozhanye. So last week I showed you some of the gains that the Russians have made. They've now consolidated that field in between the two towns. The Russians control about 30% of Urozhanye, and they control about 85% of Staromayorska. So now they've entrenched themselves even further in there. And then maybe the last area that we're going to take a look at as far as fighting is the Krinky and Kherson area. Okay, so we're going to start with Kherson. This is kind of crazy because now if you look at this map, which is on the right side of that little Telegram post, you see those arrows. Okay, so the Ukrainians have started withdrawing from Kherson. They've started moving out of these islands, and the Russians have started moving in. Now, this is a bit baffling because everything on the west side or the north side of the Dnieper River where the Ukrainians are is higher ground. So they can see everything from the apartment buildings of Kherson City, what the Russians are doing. But nonetheless, they decided to go to create a bridgehead from a town called Dakia or Dasha, and it is next to the Antonovsky Bridge. And they've been there for like 3 days. So there is speculation that the Russians may go for some kind of an offensive. Again, it will be like Kharkov. It will not be to take over an entire city. It will be to stretch the forces as much as possible. Now, as you can see in the Telegram post that's on top of this map, there was a hit in Kherson. An ammo depot was destroyed, and recently there was also a concentration of troops, maybe Mercs, in Odessa that was hit. I don't know. That's what the reports are. The Russians were fairly successful, um, uh, destroying missiles headed for the Black Sea Fleet. However, Some attack missiles did reach Belgorod, the civilian area. Several people were killed in Gorovka. Again, Lugansk city was also attacked with ATACMS fired from HIMARS. Um, so there's that, and there's also a Russian S-400 was hit. There were actually two in the last 3 weeks. And the first one, there's video confirmation. Basically, the crew understood that it was going to be destroyed, that they could not stop this missile, and they evacuated. This one, I don't know. The launcher is destroyed. Z, the right people, did mention that Russia has hundreds and hundreds of these launchers, so I guess it's better than losing the radar. In any case, it's there to show you that, as I've said on the show many times, the HIMARS is actually like it is a really good system, and the Ukrainians, they have lost several. As of now, they've lost 14 Abrams, 31 were sent. They've also lost. Let me see what the official count for Bradley's. Um, yeah, 75 Bradleys have been destroyed. And HIMARS, I mean, it depends. Like, I can say that there's at least 9 confirmed HIMARS that were destroyed since 2022.
And might
So,
I add, we've brought this up probably about a million times at this point, but bears repeating that, especially with the HIMARS, a lot of these weapon systems are operated by quote unquote Western volunteers, in which case, whether that mean Americans or maybe not in the case of the HIMARS, like other Brits, other Europeans, etc. But I think this is relevant in context of some of the escalatory rhetoric that's going on, that NATO has effectively had boots on the ground since before the beginning of this war. I don't think that's controversial to say to anyone who's been following this war since 2014. Of course, it has rapidly escalated, as it rapidly increased in number since 2022, since the Russian forces actually went into Ukraine, the proper Russian forces actually went into Ukraine. But make no mistake that there have been NATO forces in this war uh, since it started. And it will continue. As many men as they can dredge up to get there, even in an unofficial capacity, will be there. I mean, when it comes to some of the talks of the F-16s, which, like I said, we'll get into,
mhm.
do we believe these are going to be flown by the Ukrainian pilots if we expect
Yeah,
any
yeah.
efficacy with them? I mean, when the Danish donate their entire fleet of
60.
F-16s to the Ukrainians, I'm sorry, those aren't going to be Ukrainian pilots in there. And look, this
Yeah.
this is not unprecedented. I'll go back to the case of the Korean War. There were several cases where the Soviet Union, when provided aircrafts to North Korea, actually sent their pilots to operate in them under North Korean banners. Had them learn Korean and everything. And in fact, the only reason the pilot got exposed is because he was in a high intensity situation and just instinctually reverted back to his native tongue, that being Russian. But like I said, this isn't going to be anything new. And I do think that although we're not going to get an official involvement of a Western country, and if you want to consider it Western, but official involvement in NATO countries, say, barring maybe Poland, and even that's a bit iffy. I'm still not going to say that for certain, but if any country were to get involved in a more official capacity, that would be it. But we're going to fight a shadow war in Ukraine even more than we already are as this continues. But it needs to stay quiet because number one, there's a U.S. election coming up. Number two, the ramifications of an out and open intervention is just going is they can't bear those consequences. But they're going to dedicate as many resources as they can, deniably, and we're going to continue to see this. And I think the biggest news out of that is that the White House has given what was at first tacit and now is explicit permission for the Ukrainians to use American made missiles to strike inside of Russia proper. And we're not talking about just in the disputed territories, we're not talking about in the annexed oblast. I know there was a pretty nasty strike on Kherson today in terms of just like a terror bombing that took place. I don't know, probably about 10, 12 hours ago as of time of recording, which we're recording right now. It's 9:30 on Friday, June 6th, June 7th, excuse me, 2024, just for context for time that we're covering these events. But, I mean, even going into Russia proper, as we talked about with I know it's been a lot of drones. Of course, they hit the radar system. We talked about that last week. The strikes on Belgorod, we've talked about those many times, and just the strikes into Bryansk was one of the other ones in these cross-border raids. But Kiev has gotten permission for the use of these weapon systems inside Russia proper, and Russia has repeatedly, Putin in particular, has repeatedly said this is a red line. This is going to lead to escalation. We we are within our rights to hit missiles being sent from NATO territory if they're being fired at us. Once again, all this sort of escalatory rhetoric. A lot of people are putting a lot of stock into this. Now, yes, this situation can get dangerous. I don't want to downplay the stakes we're dealing with here. But I do think it's just a formalization of what has already been happening for the past 2 years, and that a lot of people, and not to insult them, not to say that they aren't as smart as me, because look, I know we all have our oversights, we all have our gaps, we all have our blind spots, as it were. But I think a lot of people are overlooking just the scale of this conflict from day one. Now, of course, they'll take into account the Western support, they'll take into account the uh, all of this foreign involvement, but I don't think they consciously or consciously are willing to take that next step forward and put the two pieces together. And you just actually sent me something about the
Yeah, yeah,
strikes
yeah,
in Kherson. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'll get just some of
yeah. Well,
pictures of that up.
apparently there was a bomb first. You don't hear a lot about Ukrainians being able to bomb anybody, so I wonder if it was a shell. But then it was followed by a HIMARS strike. So basically, 22 people are killed, including children. This is a market area, and the second attack occurred when they knew that people would be rushing to help out those who were killed in the first attack. So
Which they've been
it's
doing in Donbass for a number of years now,
for
since
for for
2014.
for for years. Yeah, I mean and the more like when they know that they're losing, they do a lot more of this. It's a kind of a revenge. It's a catharsis for Ukrainians that when
It's
they
it's much like what Israel does when you
yeah.
see. I think the one of the more better examples of that is going back to, and I don't worry, I have plenty to say about Israel, is all the strikes we saw in Syria by Israel in 2018 after the U.S. didn't follow through with outright intervention after the 2018 surgical strikes against Syria, and that it was their way of showing discontent. It was their way of lashing out. And you saw that periodically throughout the Trump administration, Israel would increase bombings on Syria or targets in Syria in particular. Interesting enough, I mean, not to excuse Trump's actions in Syria. I mean, because he did authorize the two strikes in Syria as well as a number of other operations. Now, I mean, there were attempts at withdrawal. It was a mixed legacy. We can get into that at another time. But you actually not to. I don't want to get delve too far into the Middle East just yet. It wasn't until the Biden administration when we saw outright brazen strikes of the U.S. into Syria, starting in February 2021. For those of you who recall, that's that's how that's how immediate it was after he took office. But like I said, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. But as you were saying, it is a lashing out. It is a terror bombing because I think in many ways they know this is the only way that they can really, I guess by their standards, win this war is to wage a campaign of terror against the people who betrayed the Ukrainian nation, the Votniks, I believe they call them. I'm sure you've seen that word all over. A word that's never really had much meaning, but has practically lost whatever little meaning it did have in the first place. But this will be the operative strategy going forward. And while I do believe that they are going to intensify strikes within Russia, strikes within the disputed territories within Kherson, within parts of Zaporozhye, of course, Lugansk and Donetsk. Of course, strikes are going to intensify
Mhm.
there as well. But I do think that it's going to be concentrated on these areas that they view as having quote unquote betrayed Ukraine in the interest of liberating them. So they're going to try to twist that. We're only dropping bombs on their heads. We're only dropping bombs in marketplaces and striking civilian targets because we want to liberate them. And that's what they're going to continue to go with. That's the rhetoric they're going
Yeah.
to continue to go with. It's going to get written off. All the regular shills are going to fall into place and excuse it or cover it up, or it's not happening, or it's a good thing that's happening. That kind of rhetoric that we see all of the time. And it's going to and I'm curious to see how much Ukraine can push their luck with this, but it's going to start to resemble Israel's rhetoric more and more. Now, we all know that Israel is the quote unquote exceptional nation in that regard, where they can
Mm.
they can explain these things away, they can hand wave these things away, and I do think that I don't know, maybe because of Zelensky's ethnic composition, or maybe the ethnic composition of many people in his government, or just a number of other factors, maybe the unwavering U.S. support thus far, that they think they'll be able to get away with that same kind of rhetoric. And I'm curious to see. I'm thinking that, in all honesty, they probably will, with how much war propaganda they've built up against Russia and how much propaganda they've built up about Ukraine so far. But like I said, I'm curious to see how far they can actually push this for the time being, and because and not to drone on for too long about this, you still look at the opinion polls out of a lot of European countries in particular. While anti-Russian sentiments may be up, while you may have support for uh, giving aid to Ukraine, when it comes to further involvement up to and including military force in Ukraine and the continuation of sanctions, which are only harming Europe's economy, a lot of the European public is wavering on both of those issues because they affect the bottom line.
Mm. Yeah. I also think, it's a question of like what cities can they reach, as the next city becomes an area that they're less able to harm civilians, then they're going to move to Belgorod. And if that starts to dry up, they're going to look to, a town in Kherson. Where and they do specifically go after civilians, right? Like it is. I mean, they themselves called themselves like back in 2014, or was it? I could be wrong about this. I don't know if it was the people of Donbass that called them like the Punishers, or was part of the ATO, the anti-terror thing. Um, but there was no terrorism. I mean, basically, like these people just didn't want to be part of your coup-led government that a foreign country decided to impose. That's not what they voted for. So they didn't want to be part of your stinky little country anymore.
I, I mean, going back to what you were saying, the quote unquote terrorism expressed in parts of eastern Ukraine, especially Donbass, was just calling for a return to the status quo. The only and like I said, going back to the beginning of this war, uh, talking like Maidan 2014, 2015, the only really pro-Russian sentiments existed in Crimea. Otherwise, like you had said, everyone was content to leave things the way they were, with one foot in the east, one foot in the west, and it, the western side took initiative, and they won out that way, at least for the
Hmm.
time being. Now we'll see how this war plays out. I think we all have a general idea of what the direction things are going, barring any major unforeseen events. But it was one of those cases where the state of neutrality left power up for grabs for anyone who would seize it, and in that case, it was uh, the Victoria Newlands of the world and their proxies who seized it. And perhaps you could say that was a lack of foresight on Russia's part. Perhaps you could say that more should have been done to shore up pro-Russian sentiments in Ukraine and perhaps prevent some, or at least mitigated some of this current crisis. But we are beyond that now, so we can only dwell on it so much at this point. But
Yeah.
it's going to continue. Like you said, this everything about the way Ukraine is run today is directly a result of the Maidan government, and they will continue these policies of petty ethnic nationalism. Not that ethnic nationalism is necessarily a bad thing, but to the kind of pettiness that the Ukrainians are expressing about it, this petty ethnic nationalism will continue until the current Ukrainian state apparatus collapses.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I don't know what else to add to that. That is the way it's going to go. Um, unless there's some incredible intervention that takes place, and we can't completely rule that out. Uh, that might be a segue, to
Donald Tusk might come
to
to save the day.
uh, that's vote or else. What was this thing? you either vote or like we're going to get invaded by Putin. Like it was, what the hell is he talking about?
But vote right, or else you're going to get invaded by Putin. If you don't do exactly what Donald Tusk says, Putin takes over Europe. That's how it
It's
works.
so preposterous. How do people even fall for this? And now I'm going to tell you something. An
Go
interesting
ahead,
story.
please do.
My my Romanian friend, um, he's I have no idea how he, based on his comments, how he's still on Instagram, but he is. So um, there was a post, some Romanian travel agency, and they've got Romanians dressed up in traditional costumes, doing traditional dances, according music, that kind of thing. And he says, "Look at these people, like they live something to the effect that they live in a kind of surreality because like they're completely controlled by NATO and by the US, and they're just going to erode their traditions and everything anyways, right? And why are they even bothering? Like, why do they think that their traditions are going to last?" And this guy responds with something like, "Come on, man, this is just a tourist thing. Why do you have to drag politics into this?" And then he does like this wink face, blah, 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 where he says, "By the way, NATO is building the biggest base in Europe." It's like, this is what I mean. Um, they're, how can I put it? These people they will never lead anything. They're already like, there are people who, how can I put it? They never really achieved greatness. They went from like having an ethnogenesis to, I have to find a way for my ethnicity to survive, right?
It was this politics that of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, because let's just be paint with broad brushstrokes. 1848, you have the so-called Spring of Nations. You have this rising ethnogenesis, or at least coming into awareness about one's own ethnicity across Europe. Just speaking about Europe in particular, and these places that were part of Austria, part of the Russian Empire, under some German principality, later the German Empire, etc., etc., etc. This Central Eastern Europe, this swath right here. And then, of course, you have World War One, and World War ends. You have all these new nations that don't haven't really had a historical basis for existence in several centuries, if ever. I mean, I
Or
guess
no sovereignty or
yeah. I
independence.
mean, like in some of the stronger cases, Poland once controlled a great amount of
Yeah.
territory and did have some prominence, but like I said, it was centuries from
Well, you could say the Czechs and Slovaks. I mean, I don't
certain
know, but I think they shared, Moravia, which was the first
yes,
sort
and
of Slavic state
and the
ever.
Czechs did punch a bit above their weight in terms of just like
Yeah.
inner European politics, especially when you get into the complexity of the whole Roman Empire. But once again, not to dwell too much on this, but you have a lot of these smaller ethnicities that hadn't really made their mark on history. All of a sudden, uh, this wave of idealism comes around, and it's time to have self determination, equal sovereign nations, etc., etc., etc. in this period from 1919 to 1945. And of course, I mean that's nice. You're a small burgeoning ethnicity who haven't really made your mark in history. You all of a sudden get this taste of what greater nations have enjoyed for centuries. Now, at a great cost, mind you. And these great nations didn't just stumble into this. And once again, I don't think they understood the struggle that it took. Not to downplay any historical struggles, but it's a much different kind of struggle. So they get these ideas about how to conduct themselves from these larger nations, not understanding the reality of the situation, perhaps being taken in by idealism to some degree or some sort of rose-tinted vision of the world, and then reality hits them, and they're forced to govern themselves in this very contradictory and some may even say schizophrenic way.
Right. And what I want to get at, and what my friend was trying to get at with this person was like, basically, you don't want to admit that like you bought into something that's like destroying. I mean, this guy responded with, how could Romanian traditions die? It would be like, it's impossible. They will never die. Like, think how naive that is. Like, just think about that, right? Like, it's June is gay month. Like there's photos I saw on Instagram of like I was gonna say you can post it, but honestly, it's just everybody has seen this degenerate shit anyways. But you this picture you could not tell if it was shot in Washington or San Francisco or Melbourne, Australia, or Tel Aviv, or I don't know, like somewhere in the Netherlands or Germany
Or
or
Rig or Tallinn or
yeah, yeah. Like you don't know. You just don't know. And so, but it was in Belgium. It was in Brussels. So, like he's basically trying to tell him is like our partnership with these people is like killing us, and you're doing it. You're like fixated on the Russians because you cannot accept that, kind of like, good money after bad, or um, sunk ship fallacies. Like no one can admit that sometimes when they've made a horrible investment, a horrible mistake, right? And it's just like, in many ways, liberalism, an aspect of liberalism came to the fore during the Cold War era, but another part was concealed. And when the Cold War ended, America, legitimately went for becoming a hegemon that would have a liberal world order. It wouldn't be just confined to the West plus Japan, and you could say plus Australia, right? No, they created the World Trade Organization, for instance, in the 90s. So they really went for it. And he's just, I don't know, like there's some people you're never going to reach. Because in their mind, it's kind of like a basic reptilian brain, like to think like, no, the West will make us rich. And if we stay rich, then we survive, right? No rich, no survive. So it's that kind of a thing. And it's like, um, anyways, it's old points that everybody already knows about. I don't know why I brought this up.
no, I
I'm
think
sorry,
I,
audience.
I think reiterating these things is always important. Don't get me wrong, but I'm glad you brought that up. But I mean, I do think also it's a great insight to the mentality of these people and of the differences between big nations and small nations and how small nations have decided to act like big nations in many ways. And some might say that's, I don't know, an imperialistic attitude of mine, but I think it's just more accepting the reality of just how relations between nations work. And there's not really much one can do about that. And going back to your previous point about hitching your wagons to the American Empire and what a lot of these Eastern European states do, what a lot of these states around the world do, expecting great wealth and great promise, and then ending up with pride parades, is that it does go back to the purely ideological nature of the American Empire. Because in previous eras, even earlier in the Cold War, it was a pragmatic relationship where we have a common enemy. We'll support you if you are our front line, and if worse comes worse, bear the brunt of whatever force may be facing you. And that's the way that relationships between, I guess, colonies or states that are akin to colonies, client states, puppet states, have always functioned with their masters, as it were. And going into that, I think that many of them did accept that was going to be the case, but expected something much more pragmatic, and were slammed with something far more ideological than uh, they could have ever imagined.
Right. I mean, in many ways, it's kind of like, I mean, I know Polish people, and if for instance, like, I, I had a good friend that lived with us. Like, I'm very familiar with, various Eastern European groups, right? I'm Eastern European too. I'm from North Macedonia, and it's not like what I'm saying about Romania, but North Macedonia is an exception to it. That's not what I'm suggesting. But if you look at, if I guess to clarify my point, like a lot of Poles, for instance, really believe that, the defenders of Europe and so on and so, like, as if not necessarily the only ones, but they really like having that title, right? while the rest of like Western Europe kind of just looks down on them, right? And I'm just saying that a lot of Eastern Europeans and a lot of Slavic people behave and act that way. And the Russians in many ways are not an exception to this. There are times where I think they thought of themselves in this way as well. But they are the only ones who can sort of cut ties and just say F it, like F you, we don't need you. I'm just saying all the other little countries cannot do
Yes,
this.
and the Russians, I mean, aside from just having the geography and resources and the fact that they actually do have the hard power to throw around, uh, and just going back historically, they're the only ones who really were able to define themselves as a great power on par with the Western empires. And I mean, like I said, you could make that argument for Poland maybe at one point, but even, I mean, frankly, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth deserves its own show where I just get into the gritty details of that. That might be interesting. I'm sure you would be down for that because there's a lot you can cover with that. A very interesting state in Europe, but in terms of once again the particularly Slavic peoples, Eastern European peoples, of the ones who really define themselves on par with, say, the Germans, the French, the British, etc. And while maybe from the Western perspective they don't quite see it that way, I think just looking at it objectively in terms of power, in terms of accomplishments in science, technology, culture, etc., that the Russians were the only ones who ever went toe to toe with the West proper, as it were. And it's a title that they still hold and still something that they have some ability to do, and just gauging by what we see today, and that going back, not to dwell on this point too much, a lot of these smaller nations were never able to uh, reach that point. Of course, just by virtue of the size, the few amount of people they have, perhaps their failure to coalesce into something larger, uh, for a myriad of reasons. Once again, we could spend all day discussing.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we you brought up the whole thing with Denmark. I mean, it's just phenomenal that they're donating 60 F-16s, right? I mean, there aren't even that many Ukrainian pilots.
And to
Remember,
tack
it's
that
taken them a
on,
year to learn English,
yeah,
right?
insane. But to tack onto that, the French are also they said
Yes,
they're
the
donating,
Mirage.
yeah, an undisclosed amount of Mirage 2000s. But once again, in terms of these weapon systems, they are coded either in they're coded in some Western language. That's mostly going to be English. As you said, the language barrier finding Ukrainian pilots is hard enough as it is. English-speaking Ukrainian pilots, I don't know. Maybe there's a larger overlap there, just with the kind of technical skill that it requires.
Mm,
It's the only way I can see Ukraine having a proper air force is if pilots come with the aircraft, which is not out of the realm of possibility at all.
yes.
But that's all I had mainly on Ukraine. Except I guess we could cover the quote unquote peace summit that's going to be happening.
Yes.
Has is Zelensky even going to be at this one? I couldn't get a clear
Yeah.
I couldn't get a clear answer on that because I know that the Russians weren't invited. That there was some rather strong statements from some Russian officials that saying that no, this isn't a peace conference. Once again, we've seen this song and dance a million times over. There have been other nations that also have abstained from it because they just viewed it as a joke. Concurrent with the St. Petersburg Forum, which is just a broad international meeting of just power players in general, of people who are either neutral towards or generally aligned with Russia. And I know that Putin was making some interesting remarks there that we could get into, but I don't think that there's anything at this point that warrants stressing. I think that we'd probably have to sit on it for a little bit just to see what the ramifications of those remarks actually are. But like I said, we could address that either now or at a later point, just depending on how much you have to say about it. I personally don't have much to say about it, but those are concurrent events, and I mean, I just think the funniest part is that Zelensky probably isn't even going to be at his own a fundraiser, as it were, and it's just going to be the usual cast of Western European diplomats with Blinken there, all deciding how the Ukraine conflict is just going to be solved overnight. And I want to say, of course, they know what they're doing. Of course, they know that this is just a sham. But honestly, with some of the crop of European and American politicians we see these days, I don't know how much they have bought into their own rhetoric, how much they've bought into their own narrative. And that, strangely enough, I can't believe I'm saying this, that a lot of the cynicism within the Western elite seems like it's evaporated to the point where a lot of them just believe their own propaganda.
Yeah, it does seem that way, you know. Um, I mean, I find that crazy that like people in their positions can actually believe their own propaganda. You know, the one that's really being pushed is uh, don't worry about red lines. Putin doesn't have any. Of course, you know all the red lines that they're talking about are the red line, and Putin actually mentioned this. But they're all the red lines that that Biden and his cabal of puppets said that they wouldn't do, and they ended up doing. Like I understand why they would want to give all these jet fighters to Ukraine. It's because Ukraine is losing. Like they wouldn't want to do that if Ukraine was winning, right? Macron said that he's going to train a brigade, a French trained brigade of Ukrainians, 4,500 guys. I mean, that's piddly. That's nothing. First of all, like, how does he know? I mean, he's lost hundreds of men in Ukraine already through, under the moniker of, mercenaries. But you can bet that some of those guys were possibly officers, definitely trainers. There was even a story of two of them that apparently were humanitarian workers, if you believe that. So, I mean, yeah, and this people have sort of the Western media has made you know Putin seem irate and almost, not overreacting but almost overreacting to all these permissions that the Western leaders have given Ukraine. Right, this is a new narrative. Ukraine would have won if they gave them permissions to strike deep into Russia. Like it's just folly, but. Um, so they've said this, and they're wondering why Putin's rhetoric is we're going to arm other countries, we're going to do this, we're going to strike you asymmetrically, and so on. I mean, it's because he knows that those planes are going to be flown by non-Ukrainians, and we don't, they don't know if like if the West would be willing to use a tactical nuke, right? Like 2 weeks ago, three radar stations that are over the horizon radar stations to detect nuclear ballistic missiles were damaged or destroyed by Ukrainian drones, right? So, I mean, what is he supposed to say?
Yeah, it's not really anything you can say to that, and in many ways, it does feel like we're just going around in circles. Yet the rhetoric keeps escalating in those same circles that we're going around, and I think that's just going to be par for the course with something like this. And of course, we'd already brought up about the escalatory rhetoric coming out of Russia with the pushing back, saying that they are open to supporting any resistance movements against any sort of American foreign policy move across the world. There was a Russian submarine moving to base in Cuba once again for the first time in I think since the 60s, since the original Cuban Missile Crisis. The talk of selling military hardware to places like Cuba and Venezuela. Like I said, this isn't anything we haven't seen before, but it is an escalation, and the Russians, seeing the situation right now, are upping the ante with their own rhetoric because that's what the West has been doing for the past 2 years. And I think this is the first time I haven't seen Putin be explicitly conciliatory. Now, there even were hints of conciliatory rhetoric in his recent statements, as there always is, because I just think that's just how he operates. But in terms of it explicitly being there, saying there's some sort of off ramp or some sort of chance for negotiation. He didn't explicitly say that this time, which is surprising coming from him because he usually makes it very clear when that is the case. And I mean, you wouldn't know that if you listen to
Hmm.
any mainstream media. And I'm saying that for better or for worse. I know that I've talked to a number of Russians who said that he's too soft on some of these issues. That they could use him or somebody of stronger composition when it comes to that. And well, I'll refrain from commenting too much. I mean, fair enough, it's their opinion on their country and that's foreign policy. But I think it's just, it, I just think it's inaccurate to say that Putin hasn't been extremely conciliatory, even through I would say his most recent statements. It's just that what he
Hmm.
has explicitly said since the beginning of this war, since before this war broke out, is now being said, in my opinion, implicitly, maybe not at all. And uh, I think that's concerning when you push someone who is seemingly a very patient man to those limits, and that uh, a number of very bad outcomes could come out of that. And like I said, I think we need to wait for this situation to develop a bit more before I say anything too concrete about the current round of escalation between the U.S. and Russia. But I am not very optimistic that it'll get better, yet at the same time, I don't think it's going to spiral into anything uncontrollable for the time being.
Yeah, like I still, I mean, there are people crazy enough on American television, that are part of think tanks like the Hoover Institute, who think America should be fighting a three front war. I mean, they'll say, "Well, we're already fighting in the Middle East and in Europe." Well, you're kind of not. Uh, you're gonna have to get more involved, and of course, they're also advocating for a war in Asia over Taiwan, naturally, right? But I mean, really, are they going to do that? I think they're looking for a way to stretch this war out as long as possible and see who gives up first.
And of course, I think one thing that we shouldn't overlook is just their bottom line when it comes to the greed aspect of this, that they're making a killing off this war. 10% for the big guy. We've heard all that kind of stuff before. Now, I do think a lot of these people, maybe not necessarily Biden himself or his administration, might have. And now, I don't think Biden thinks much of anything these days. Let me just be clear about that. But a lot of his administration have a much more ideological and just stronger commitment in that regard. But there's a lot of people operating this war on the American side, especially. Not saying it doesn't exist at all on the Russian side, but in the Western side in particular, who just view this as a cash cow and are willing to keep this going on as long as it's profitable. And if it starts to go against just their bottom line, their economic self interest, a lot of them will start to falter on it. And I do think that we've seen that to some degree, especially when it comes to the sanctions packages or certain areas they've refused sanctions because, once again, they've tried to push for sanctioning uranium imports from Russia. That once again fails, and I mean that's mainly blocked by France because France is a big proponent of nuclear energy within their own country. But you need something to power those power plants, and lo and behold, Russian uranium is a rather abundant source. Not the most abundant in the world, of course. There is West Africa, which had its recent spurt of instability, so who knows how shipments are going to be affected out of there. Now, it doesn't seem like much has come out of the Niger coup, at least so far, but when it
Mhm.
comes to uranium imports, I know that the coup was done with an explicitly anti-Western bent, so it's probably going to hamper any exports to the European Union. I mean,
And as far as I know, the Americans are leaving. The French are already gone.
oh yeah, yeah, and you see this all over the place, especially in Africa, resource-rich parts of Africa. The French are turning tail and running from uh, what outpost they had left from the colonial era, and they're being displaced by Wagner. They're being displaced by Chinese investment, and Africa is open for business to the east. And it was the West's game to lose, and lo and behold, they lost it.
Hmm.
I, I don't really know what more you can
Yeah.
say. We could go through and document every single instance in the past, let's just say 30 years into Cold War, about every time the West has shot itself in the foot. We this would be a 12-hour show if that were the case, and I don't want to keep you all here this long. But like I said, I don't think these things can really be understated. What a predicament that we've put ourselves in, and that it's probably only going to get worse. Not in any sort of dramatic fashion, just gradually worse until things just stop functioning. Because that's the way these systems tend to fall apart. It's rarely something grand or cataclysmic. It's just something that slowly erodes away over the time.
Yeah.
And I mean, at least with something grand and cataclysmic, while it may have very negative immediate effects, it does completely wipe the slate clean. Not that I'm saying I want that to happen, and does make some sort of retrospect and rebuilding easier. But when you fall into the state of slow decline that I think we're in right now, and I would say a lot of people would probably agree we're in right now, it makes it harder for things to change because people become complacent. They get okay with a little bit less every year. They get okay with a little bit more dysfunction every year until it just stops working. Until uh, the formal legal reality of, say, a nation in this case, or any sort of organization just ceases to exist one day, that it just stops operating. And like I said, that's arguably a more dangerous situation because people do get lulled into, I wouldn't even say a false sense of security, but get lulled into a complacency. And we see the outcome with that. And like I said, I think that's been happening in the West for quite some time now, especially, I would say, post 2008 after the economic crisis. And I think that's affected every aspect of Western politics, Western culture, and Western society. Not to get off of too much of a tangent here, and I think that's been part of the reason why we have failed to see any great change. Even so-called reformers who came along within that time period have failed to deliver. Perhaps they were never meant to deliver. Perhaps they were controlled from the beginning. That's a conversation we can have, but it it does make change hard, and not to downplay the human or other costs of cataclysmic collapses, but it does make rebuilding easier in a way. And like I said, I frankly I don't want either to happen. I wish the situation would just stabilize, even if we're under a regime I weren't the most satisfied with. At least things would be functional. At least it would be a return to some sort of some sort of, for lack of a better word, normalcy. And
Hmm.
you could organize from there. You could fix the problems from there. I mean, because even if we were to go back to, say, economic prosperity of the 90s or the early 2000s, and just the unipolar moment. Not that I'm saying we should go back to that, but some sort of social and economic situation akin to that. I would have plenty of problems, but I wouldn't worry that the system is just going to keep degrading and getting worse. I would feel a sense of confidence, even if I vehemently disagreed with the regime, that uh, you know, life will go on, things will function. And I'm not saying I have any great, like, doomer, pessimistic feelings, more so than usual. But as it goes on every day, even regardless of the Biden administration, but I would say especially with the Biden administration, I look at things, I look at the state of the world, and think, how are things still functioning?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that you hear. Americans are incredibly dissatisfied with, like just the state of, um, to put it, j- the domestic situation in America. You know, infrastructure, immigration, um, competency, loss of faith in institutions. You know, some a war has a way of, you know, it's a distract. It can be a distraction, right? And that's what scares me about what they'll do. Because you know, when this war started, you and I said that so much is riding on this war that almost anything is possible. Like they would do almost anything, and now, you know, 2 years and 3 months later, we see that, you know, they really haven't improved capacity to, you know, defeat Russia quickly. Maybe both sides understand this can't happen quickly. Um, but nothing has been done. And so that makes you think like they're going to resort to something extreme. If it looks like, you know, Ukraine is going to lose, or I mean, when you see, for instance, Denmark, okay, we talked about they're just giving away hundreds of billions of dollars worth of aviation to the Ukrainians, right? Um, I mean, it took them decades probably to amass all this, and they're just going to give this away in the wink of an eye to the Ukrainians. But um, speaking of Denmark, WeBean did a video where he mentioned like Denmark doesn't even have a brigade, right? They don't even have that many people in the military. And Denmark has a goal for 2028 and 2029. Like none of these goals coincide with like ending the war in Ukraine more quickly. Like obviously they've made up their minds about how this war is supposed to go or what's supposed to be done in a worst case scenario. But going on a war footing is not one of those bits of preparation. They expect to be there. Let's say Trump is reelected. I mean, is elected, or Biden is reelected. They expect after the first term, by then they'll reach some of those goals. Well, I mean, 4 years is still quite a ways off, you know? Anyways, I find that very peculiar. And that's what scares me about them doing something drastic. Because they've decided
Absolutely.
not to do something that would be rational. I mean, I don't want them to win. I hate them, but I'm just saying if I was one of them, this wouldn't be like what I would be doing. Now you could argue and say, look, before 2022, everything is about a war footing. All right. I mean, yeah, I understand. Uh, but you will have to do more. I mean, maybe we'll get into it. I don't know if we have time, but one of the things that Putin said at the St. Petersburg uh, Economic Forum was that America has asked Ukraine to lower the age of conscription, like below 20. I mean, they already pushed them to do it to go below 27. Now going to 25, this is the most sensitive area for Ukraine because this area is, in the demographic pie chart, this is the area where it's the smallest population. You know, Ukraine was so economically devastated after the fall of the Soviet Union, and it never got rid of its oligarchy and it had so much flight.
Once
11
again, it
million
was the only
Ukrainians.
Soviet republic to have a decrease in standard of living since 1991. The rest,
Yes,
even the Central Asian ones, and I think even
and it was
Moldova.
the only republic that ever had all its debts paid by Moscow. There's just no reason. There's no reason. I mean, even now you have countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, who are buying tons of gold along with the Chinese, unprecedented even for the Chinese, who have been doing this a long time because they're preparing for this, I suppose this world where the American dollar is just not going to be used to the extent that it is being used now. And actually,
And
that's the
mind
other
you,
thing that
on that
Putin
same
mentioned.
note, that a lot of these Central Asian countries have made themselves third parties to help evade Russian sanctions to Europe.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So I mean, anyways, so it's it lost 11 billion civilians even before Maidan. From 91, they just fled the country. Um,
I think post Maidan up until 2022, it was about a million a year leaving because it was at the collapse of the Soviet Union. I believe it was at 52 million when.
yeah, 52 or 51, then it dropped to 40 something and
And mind you, it had the Donbass, which
39.
was one of the strongest industrial centers in the Soviet Union. On top of the coal mining and natural resources, they had mines and minerals in the west, up in the Carpathian regions. That's
Yeah.
untouched. They had most of the Black Sea coast, at least at the northern part of it. This should have been a very economically viable and productive nation that uh, at one point had the opportunity to be a broker between the West and Russia. And this is the path that it ended up on. And as you said, they weren't able to purge or even rein in their oligarchs. It was really what happened in Ukraine is what the aim was for Russia. And
Yes, yes.
they failed to do that. Now, like I said, Russia didn't purge the oligarchs completely. They managed to rein them in enough to where they could have a functional and sovereign nation. And look, their influences, for better or for worse, we could get into the gritty details about that at some other time. But Ukraine is what happens if Yeltsin's Russia was taken to its logical conclusion.
Hmm. And to that, but before I get to that, I just wanted to say that Putin at this economic forum in St. Petersburg, and he said they're going to get them to lower the age. He's implying below 25. And when that happens, they will have to get rid of Zelensky. Obviously he's implying that the population will be very much against it. I thought it was interesting that he thought both America will tell him to do it, he will do it, and then they will remove him. So that was interesting. The other thing he said, speaking of oligarchs and speaking how Ukraine is kind of, what has happened for Ukraine is what they ultimately wished could happen for Russia. And you know, Putin said something that was very strange. That didn't seem particularly astute as he usually is. He said, you know, the capitalization, the adoption of capitalism in Russia during the 90s, it wasn't for like a criminal sake. I'm thinking like it literally was. I mean, yeah, in theory, maybe that's that's not what should have happened,
I
but
mean, yes, I think everyone at that point, except the most hardline of Soviet nostalgia people, could agree that the centralized economy had to be drastically reformed. But from day one, the privatization schemes, even before the Soviet Union collapse, were a looting operation.
yeah.
And
Yeah, so anyways, I
yeah,
thought that was strange. But he said a lot of things that were pretty astute overall. Some things, we've heard
yeah,
before.
and I think it's what you'd mostly expect from him. He plays into the political rhetoric about the things he has to, of course, and uh, like I would recommend going through his remarks. There, who was I know they were all over Telegram. There were a few channels doing them, but you could very easily
Yeah.
find footage um, and text of that on Telegram as well. But I figured with that we can move into
Mm.
Israel's continual spiral into I don't even know what the hell to call it at this point, but Israel keeps repeatedly shooting itself in the foot is all I can really
Yeah.
say. And we see a nation, quote unquote, with the Operation Gaza is unable to root out Hamas militants. These Hamas militants have entrenched themselves pretty well. You even have some people in Netanyahu's cabinet calling to just end the operation, that it's more trouble than it's worth at this point. And while the civilian casualties have been atrocious, while Israel has done terrible things in Gaza, as we've seen time again, most recently Rafah, what we have right now is now you can't really find official numbers, but you read the reports, you look at the progress of the IDF. They are losing badly in a military sense. They are taking massive casualties, or higher casualties than they should, to a group like Hamas. That they failed to root out these quote unquote tunnels, these underground systems they've created, and that every time they walk into a hospital or a school, they say, "We've rooted out the new Hamas base." Film some camera with some stupid IDF conscript explaining the situation in broken English about how, look, they were hiding Kalashnikovs in a hospital, therefore we had to level the thing. Meanwhile, they still have an operational guerrilla warfare operation against the IDF, to the point where I'm sure Hamas, even Hamas combatants, have probably taken more casualties than the IDF. But given what the IDF has to work with, given what the Israelis have to work with, like I said, it's very hard to find official numbers on these things. But
Yeah, because I
the,
don't think they know.
no, they don't, and I think that they're trying to keep these quiet in order to satiate the public. But the IDF is taking much higher loss than it should have. It's not making the progress it should in this operation. Theoretically, an Israeli operation into Gaza should have been the the 3 days Mark Milley said it would take Russia to get to Kiev, but it should have been an open and shut case if this was really what we were led to believe it was. Now, we of course it wasn't going to be, but I do have to wonder how high, number one, the Israeli casualties are. Number two, how high the Hamas casualties are, not including the civilians of actual combatants, actual KIA. But when it comes to KIA wounded, etc. But when it comes to this, how many losses can the Israelis bear? What is the public threshold? I'll go back to the example of the 2006 intervention in Lebanon, where protest over the casualty count did end that operation, and that was under Ariel Sharon, I believe. I can't
Mhm.
remember off the top of my head, but I believe it was. So, once again, it wasn't Netanyahu. That was when he was out of power. But and look, the IDF has, especially Netanyahu, has interest in making the IDF continue this operation as long as possible, in order to keep himself in power, and in order to keep the war cabinet in power, while his own approval ratings slip, while his grasp over the country in general slips. Mind you, before October 7th, all of 2022, 2023 were just massive protests against him, against
Yeah.
his
And they won
judicial
for
reform.
months and weeks.
Yeah, and it went on for it was on and off. It was almost every weekend at one point, and
Hmm.
it took. And I don't believe it. It lends credence to the fact that Israel may have false flagged itself in order for Netanyahu to justify his remaining in power. Like I said, I don't believe that, but given the circumstances of what happened with Netanyahu, it lends itself to those kind of conspiracy theories at the end of the day, because that's how bad he has screwed himself in terms of his political career. And now they're talking about opening a front in Lebanon against Hezbollah, in which case the United States has said in a back channel communication to Israel that you intervene in Lebanon, you go up against Hezbollah, you risk more direct confrontation against the Iranians, especially now that Israel and Iran have had their skirmishes, have had their back and forth. And we're talking about, excuse me, Hezbollah, which
Hmm.
has had a decade of combat experience recently, and more than a decade of combat experience recently in Syria, in this asymmetric warfare, in this guerrilla warfare, much stronger ties with the Iranians than Hamas does. Hamas is, look, of course, they've received Iranian support before, but they're not Iranian proxies by any means. In fact, they've had a number of disagreements over the years to the point where it was up until 2017 before Hamas actually reconciled with the Syrian government, because they sided with the so-called revolution in Syria up until then. It took them 6 years to get over that and to actually come to peace terms with it. So, but when we're talking about Iranian influence, Iranian proxies actually being able to attack Israel, if they're going to open a war on their northern front, that being Lebanon and possibly into parts of Syria, they're going up against the brunt of Iranian strength, and they'll do the exact same thing they're doing in Gaza, perhaps to less success, because these are more organized operations, and even if the Syrian military proper doesn't get involved, you still do have some anti-air system operated by Hezbollah, operated by these pro-Iranian groups in Syria. So it's I don't know what the possible logic behind opening up the northern front. If the once again, assuming it's not all speculation, it's not all saber rattling, but what possible reason Israel could have to open up a northern front in this broader conflict?
I mean, they're going to. Okay, so I'll give you the numbers, and just a little bit of a historical context for Israel fighting in Lebanon. So Israel invaded Lebanon back in the mid 80s, and they stayed there until the year 2000. Now, they controlled about 50-60% of the country at one point. But I just want people to understand in the 90s, that got greatly reduced. They were just in the southern area. in the few years prior to them leaving in the year 2000. Okay, just so people understand that. So apparently they've called on more reserves, over 50,000, and they're going to go in with more men than, in the 20th century. Uh, you know, Not 2006. Of course, that was a smaller force. Hezbollah, uh, they definitely beat them. Okay. Um, I mean, the Israelis wanted the southern part. They never got it, and they're going to go for it again because they feel like they're kind of humiliated right now. Over 60,000 Israelis have left northern Israel. The second time this week in the Golan Heights have come under attack. And when you think of Putin talking about he's going to give weapons to certain countries, right? Like might not go after Israel, maybe not right away, but like think of all the attacks that Iranian aligned militias in Iraq and Syria, particularly those in Iraq, have attacked U.S. bases, both in Iraq, Jordan, and Syria. Think of Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, right? I'm just saying it's probably inevitable that like some of these missile systems, or at least their technology, will be given to those who would attack Israel uh, on the Lebanese border. I think that's inevitable. Uh, might not happen in 2024, but I think it's an inevitability. So, what could be the purpose? I mean, I think they're frantic. I don't know. I think they think like it could be a possible victory. You have to admit, like, I mean, the first few months, especially the first 3 months of this war, it looked like, all the. I'm not trying to say that they're not cowards, right? But the fact that the Arabs did not come rushing they could not do more for the Palestinians that has been done, or did not do as much as could be conceived they could do. Uh, Now it's looking like if this war keeps prolonging, right, that is more detrimental to Israel than um, going about it quickly. But I don't know how going about it quickly could happen for Israel because I mean I think they're at a breaking point. They believe, and, and maybe they're talking about their own psychology, but they believe that if they don't destroy Hamas and all the enemies in Israel, then they can't live in Israel anymore. And I think something like that is there in their subconscious. And this week in particular, for instance, more Israelis, the highest Israeli count, the highest count of Israeli soldiers getting killed in Gaza in 2024 was happened this week. It's been the highest since October. Now, of course, October was on a whole other level. Don't get me wrong, but just so people understand the amount of attacks that both Hezbollah and Hamas have done, particularly Hamas in this case, but Hezbollah has been responsible for barracks being blown up, for radar stations being blown up. They're unrelenting. And then you have the Houthis. The Houthis have made one of the American aircraft carriers retreat. There was a whole debate about whether it got hit or not. And this is photoshopped, that's not photoshopped. It doesn't matter. It's gone now. It's left the Red Sea. So the
Operation
Houthis.
Prosperity Guardian is a complete failure by every objective sense of the word.
Can you
Uh,
imagine China asks the Houthis to attack the U.S. naval fleet because if we attack, they will kill us. But you, the Houthis, they're afraid of you. I just think that's a horrible Chinese act. I can't do it. But anyways, like
I could, but I'm interested in keeping the show on the air.
yes, I
But
know what you mean.
but I mean, yeah, we've established this before that Russian ships, Chinese ships, certainly Iranian ships, they can all pass through without trouble. The Egyptians
Yeah.
are going to let them through because the Egyptians have a sense of economic self-interest, it seems. But these Western vessels are still, at this point, being forced to divert around the Horn of Africa, around the Cape, and all the way around the continent of Africa, like they had to do before the canal was built.
Hmm.
This is it's completely changed the dynamics of global shipping, and it also makes the Arctic route seem that much more enticing with the development of the icebreakers, with
Yeah.
uh, the changing dynamics there. And Russia and China, of course, have been at the forefront of investing in icebreakers, investing in vessels that can travel in the Arctic conditions, that can travel in these adverse conditions. And it also opens up a corridor for land trade. And what has been the major trade project the past decade, the Belt and Road Initiative.
Hmm.
And
And in fact, Putin was asked at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum by apparently an author that is sort of an admirer of, let's say, pre-communist Russia, Tsarist Russia, and he asked him about, St. Petersburg was brought up, and Peter the Great, and a window to Europe, and so on. And Putin said, Europe isn't the future. The Arctic and the East is. So I thought that was interesting.
oh
I
yes,
mean, there's just so many things that we're talking about now that uh, popped up during this forum. This Is it fair to call it a conference? I don't know. I don't think so.
I think it was officially a forum, but it was a market change in rhetoric from Putin, who was always tentatively pro-West. Just to return
Yeah.
to that point, and just going back to the Houthis, to the Red Sea, to the Suez Canal, it's become impassable for how much of the world's trade. What Americans and Europeans, that still constitutes what percentage of the world economy? It has to be at least like
Hmm.
40 some
Hmm.
percent. Maybe I don't think it's quite a majority anymore, just with the meteoric rise of China, but it's still a significant chunk of the global economy can no longer use these trade routes because they've been shut out by the Houthis, who once again aren't even necessarily Iranian proxies. Now the Iranians do have proxies in places like Iraq and Syria. Don't get me wrong; they have people who do take their marching orders. But when it comes to groups like the Houthis, while they may be aligned, there is an independent chain of command. There is independent interest there to the point where perhaps the Iranians would have been more amenable to a de-escalation at this point. Not that I'm
Hmm.
saying they
Hmm.
would be, but even if that were the case, the Houthis are still once again independent actors who are capable of doing this. Now the Iranians will, I doubt they'll throttle supplies of them just because of the greater game that's at play here. But it does. I see no other way to put it, and then it seems completely counterintuitive for Israel to open up the northern front expecting a quick and easy war, unless they are expecting something a bit more drawn out. But it is just that absolute. It's that zero sum game to the point where it's either us or them. We need to purge all our enemies from the region because we can't find any sort of diplomatic recourse with any of these countries. We can't find any sort of uh, avenue for any degree of peace. It's either we win or
Yeah.
they win, and
They
that's
made it an existential. They made it an existential fight. It didn't have to be, but now it is.
yeah. I
Now,
mean,
if they don't win, they really do lose everything.
look at look at what they were able to do in the 70s and 80s. They were able to now through the Americans. They had to, of course, call in the the protector of them to broker peace between them and Egypt and them and the Jordanians, but they had enough diplomatic leverage, certainly, over the course of the past 20, 30 years, where they probably could have forced that with Lebanon, Syria, and maybe even they were lucky Iran. It was amazing, not to dwell too much in the past, how much the hardline Zionists in both the United States and Israel were opposed to the Iran deal when it was probably the only avenue that was ever going to pacify Iran, short of
Mm-hmm.
outright
Hmm.
intervention. And even that wasn't good enough for them. Even playing the slow game, even bringing Iran into the Western sphere, making it into, say, another Saudi Arabia, where sure it's not a liberal country, but it's Western aligned. It plays the game all right. Even that wasn't good enough for them to the point where it was The Iranians need total regime change. It needs to be under American occupation.
Yeah.
Any sort of military economic power they have has to be cratered because they present a threat to Israel.
Yeah.
Two countries away, they still present a threat to Israel. Look, yeah, I know they have their assets elsewhere, but that was the line of Netanyahu. That was the line of the American neocons, and they have followed, to say once again, that line to its logical conclusion.
Yeah.
And with that, they have made this into an existential war when it frankly didn't need to be. Not that these countries over would have been thrilled with Israel, but they probably could have begrudgingly come to terms with it. I mean, even Trump with I think the Abraham Accords were a bit of a joke, don't get me wrong, but even there was some diplomatic effort there in order to pacify the situation, try to coalesce these countries into one major coalition against the Iranians, which was, I'll admit, while I think was stupid, a lot more coherent than whatever's happening right now. And I mean, whatever's happening right now is just Israel saying if we don't win, everyone else is going to pay for this, and that we're going to find a method to win, and that you have to help us eviscerate the Gaza Strip, or else you don't support us enough. And well, once again, it is the the standard Israeli rhetoric would, to a degree that we have not previously seen, but also dumbed down beyond our understanding. It's higher intensity, lower intelligence. Not that it was ever that high of intelligence, but at least they were able to form something that at least could masquerade as a coherent argument. But at this point, they've just completely given up with the pretense. It is just haranguing and browbeating, countries into supporting them. And one thing I love that Israel does, not to get off on too much of an aside here, is they take the few allies they supposedly have. They always complain about how many countries hate them and how few countries actually stand with them. And then what they do is they go to their so-called allied countries and berate them for not supporting them enough.
Yeah, I don't know why they think like countries are obligated to like them. Like
Be,
it's
because
so stupid.
they got a bum deal in the
Yeah.
20th century. Okay,
Yeah, yeah,
that means we have to.
I've heard. I've heard. Yeah.
No, that's the logic. Why that's why we have to support Ukraine. That's why
Oh,
they
of
have to support
course.
these other countries. If your country got a bum deal in the 20th century, unless you're Serbia, you're entitled to all the support in the world. That's yeah. Unless you're Serbia or unless you're Hungary, that's how it works. But no, that's the logic they operate on. I don't see many other avenues of any sort of even white peace for Israel at this point, where they just call the whole thing off or return to the status quo pre-October 7th. They've burned that bridge a long time ago. They burned that bridge on October 8th, and I don't think that Netanyahu have any intention of doing that. And I, once again, not that I think that Israel would be just fine without the influence of Netanyahu. Don't get me wrong, but the man has tied him staying out of jail to Israel single-handedly eliminating all of its rivals. They think that they can revamp these programs they had with Project the New American Century, with their influence in the Pentagon, with Douglas Feith, all those people, to where they can get uh, the 5 countries in 7 years that what was his name, the American general talked about when it came to the regime change plans, and
Hmm.
they think they can still do that. And I don't know if they actually think that, or they're just so desperate that's the only plan they have, and they're going to push that because they've painted themselves in the corner, much like the American Empire, and it being. I don't want to call Israel a client to the American Empire because we all know the dynamic relationship there, but it being an integral part of the American Empire, let's put it that way, also lacks the same ability to negotiate as the wider American Empire, where it is just dictating demands. If you don't accept them, there's no negotiation to be had. Therefore, we must fight an existential war. And this is not how countries survive long term. This is not how empires survive long term. Concessions always have to be made at some point. You always have to take a little bit of a loss. Sometimes you have to lick your wounds, heal up, and come back a decade or two later in order to address the problem. And that you have to take the punches as they come. But for reasons I think we all know why, and there's a number of them, but for reasons I think that we all generally understand, the American Empire and by extent Israel are unable to take that action. Which is once again vital if you want to play this imperial game. You have to learn how to take these hits. You have to learn how
Hmm.
to take a loss in the short term in order not to destroy all of your prospects in the long term, which is it seems to what we've been doing since the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, a lot of people have, well, people in our sphere, they've mentioned America's inability to play the soft game anymore. You know, um, was it off air though? I mean, there's maybe only one promising example, but was it off air that we talked about conscription of dual citizens?
Oh yes, yes.
Any,
We didn't get into
yeah, it
that
was
on
off
a.
air. But I'll get to it. But the thing is yeah, everything is go for broke. Everything is, if we don't do this, we're gonna die. Like it's almost like, well, okay, yeah, the Cold War is over, but and I know I spent 70 years talking about communism, but okay, it wasn't really about communism. It was really just about my hegemony. And like they can't tolerate living um in a world where they still have to make negotiations, sometimes concessions. They're still going to be on top, but all of this is just unacceptable. It just blows my mind how that's not good enough. Now, one way you can look at it is, well, the reason we have this is maybe um, maybe it has to do with let's say that there's a separate group of elites for whom this is so urgent and prescient and has to be accomplished now. I don't know. Like it's very odd.
And on that same thread, I do think a relevant story in the American Empire's inability to negotiate or accepts any sort of deviation from the course that they had set is some of the new news out of U.S. Georgian relations, which is you had Matthew
Hmm.
Miller, who is the clown spokesman for the State Department, come out, and I want to read his direct quote here. The United States remains deeply concerned about the anti democratic actions of the Georgian Dream Party, as well as its recent statements and rhetoric. These actions risk undermining Georgia's European future and are
Okay,
constantly
so
are contrary to the Constitution of Georgia. Matthew Miller, constitutional scholar of the nation of Georgia, uh, and wishes of its people. Secretary Blinken recently announced a comprehensive review of all bilateral cooperation between the United States and Georgia. As part of this review, the department has implemented a new visa restriction policy to address these actions under Section 212 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Today, as part of the policy, we're taking steps to introduce visa restrictions for dozens of Georgian citizens. The Georgian government still has time to turn everything back. This is not only about a recently passed law, but about the statements they made about rejecting the path they've been on for so long. Mind you, this was over the anti-NGO bill. Now that you
yes,
have the Georgians coming out and pursuing a law similar to Russia, where it bans the LGBTQ CIA propaganda in the public forum, and they also talk about charting an independent course for Georgia. And I think Georgia so far is the only nation in the world who has, I mean, think what you will about them, but they've managed to turn their nose up to Russia while also not bowing to the will of the Americans. Now we'll see. Now look, let's be clear. The Georgians have a very robust economic relationship with the Russians, despite their rhetoric. They
yeah,
can they
biggest trading partner.
yeah, they can go on all day about it. They can thumb their nose at the Russians, but at the end of the day, biggest trading partner, a vital economic partner.
Yeah,
But it is interesting to see how much they can thumb their nose at Russian rhetoric while also defying the American empire and seemingly untouched. Once again, the American empire, they can put these sanctions against these Georgian officials. They can try to crack down on Georgia, mobilize what NGOs they do have left in the country after this law does take full effect, and assuming that is at least semi-successful. But at the end of the day, it is just simply being the economic orbit of Russia, which of course is going to open the door to India, China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These other economic powers that are outside of the orbit of the West, uh, and it keeps your country online. It keeps your country from being destroyed by sanctions. And I do think that
it is a way of buying time. What they're
absolutely,
doing. Yeah.
absolutely. And I do think what they did is a watershed moment. Not that
Hmm.
Georgia has become pro-Russia by any means, nor am I saying they should or shouldn't. I mean, it's not really that relevant in the grand scheme of things with the size of nation it is. But they've shown that the quote unquote westernization path can be rejected. The idea of pursuing EU and NATO membership is not the only path forward for a European state. You're also seeing murmurs of that in places like Serbia right now, where Serbia is also, I wouldn't say it's outright denouncing it the same way as Georgia, but the the process for Serbia getting the EU has been hampered. Of course, the Bulgarians have raised up some sort of concern about the treatment of minorities and of Bulgarian minorities in Serbia, et cetera,
Oh
as what
Lord.
always happens in order to try to stymie their EU prospects. Which, I mean, I don't think most Serbs are going to care at that point. I think a lot of them are over the let's just say, siren call of so-called westernization and integration into Europe. Turkey, which had been an aspiring EU candidate for a number of years, while it hasn't officially renounced those aspirations, the directions it's taking diplomatically and economically show that it's lost its infatuation with the idea of joining the European project. And to return to Putin's comments, that Europe is not the is not going to chart the course of the future anymore. And I think that has been made abundantly clear by the fact that they've shown themselves not to have a sovereign country on the continent that has any sort of diplomatic weight. Sure, you can point to some firebrands out there, like Orban in Hungary, like Fico in Slovakia. Admirable as their efforts may be, as I have said many times before, Hungary and Slovakia don't have that much power to really move things on the continent. And the major powers, the French, the Germans, the British, I guess if you want to consider the Italians a major power, they have the technically the fourth largest economy in Europe, at least pre-sanctions. Who knows what those look like now? None of those countries have the ability to really go against whatever commands come from Washington. It, while sure they might theoretically have the power, they might theoretically be able to put together some sort of coalition. They're not going to. They're completely compromised. They are completely under the thumb of the American empire, and any sort of alternative path is not going to come from there. And
Yeah.
I do think is a shame because I think a strong European bloc, especially one that isn't at Russia's throat and some sort of maybe not even friendship but mutual understanding and détente between the two would be positive for them and the world as a whole. But that's not going to happen. The Europe, especially Western Europe, is far too subjugated to the American empire in order for that to come to fruition in the time being, and that it would require monumental shifts in global politics in order for something even resembling that to come. And even some of the discontent against the recent sanctions, that really doesn't mean much because you also have the U.S. violating its own sanctions on a daily basis as well. Uh, so once again, I know I keep walking around in circles with this, but
Hmm.
this even from the perspective of an empire, none of this looks sustainable. None of this looks like it has any prospects going into the future. Whether you love or hate this project, I think you have to be objective and admit that it, it's
Yeah.
running on who knows what. I guess you could say it's just
I
running
mean,
on
it's
empty. It's
reputational
yeah,
now,
yeah, it's
right? Like
absolutely.
it's the reputation of the dollar, and I mean, it really is. It's it survives as long as the dollar survives, and you can look at like what um, you can look at what was the country that you just mentioned.
In terms of what,
Oh, Georgia.
yeah,
You can look at
George.
Georgia's decision as a kind of barometer of the way the war is going in Ukraine. Like, there's no way Georgia would make that kind of a move if right if Russia were losing. It's impossible.
If Georgia smelled the blood in the water, I fully believe that they would reopen the issue of Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Absolutely.
And they're not. They've more or less accepted that it's over, it's done, it's gone. And I remember they were trying to, at least Zelensky was trying to, and other actors were attempting to get Georgia to open up that front after the initial success of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2022. But as you said, the Georgians are a good barometer for this. If they sense any sort of sentiment that they could get away with a more anti-Russia policy
Yeah.
and align themselves with the West, they would. But there still is a strong enough sense of national self-preservation where they're going to begrudgingly tolerate their economic relationship with the Russians despite any other feelings, because that's the path forward, and that what the West offers now is not profitable; it's ideological.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really about saving the American empire. Now, I'm not an economy or finance bro. I don't know anything about that. Well, very, very little. But there was an interesting comment that I saw from a German on a YouTube in a YouTube comment section that was talking about this, and it says, "Let's talk about 2008 and the Lehman Brothers financial crisis. It was old Europe, especially my country, Germany, who saved your U.S. dominance. Looking back, it was clearly a big mistake." And somebody responded with, "In fact, there was a US move against Europe. It's the biggest economic competitor, followed through by backing Brexit and following and blowing up Nord Stream." I mean, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I always did get when we were talking about how Brexit failed so much, like it didn't solve any of the cultural issues,
Or
right?
really any issues at all, including migration, actually gotten worse, and the pool of places they're taking
Literally
migration,
got
the
worse.
pool of places where they're taking migrants from, it has once again, I'd take polls over whatever they're bringing in now, but that's just me personally.
Yes,
But yeah,
yes.
yeah. Going back to your point about what an abject failure Brexit was on an economic, on a cultural level, on just anything you can imagine. Uh,
Like it made them poorer and it solved nothing, which is not like what we thought would happen. I mean, we were wrong. I could not believe how well the regime did. And in retrospect, and I have felt like this for many years. In retrospect, it felt like it was something that the regime wanted.
I agree, and don't get me wrong.
I could be wrong about it, but if it felt like I don't know. Remember that happened before Trump got elected, right? Before. So if you're the regime, you're thinking, okay, we don't want uh, we, we have to punish Europe. We need to survive. Um, it has to be cannibalized. It is what it is. Um, Brexit will help facilitate this. So
And it also captures the discontent in the population, because the sentiments behind Brexit, I completely agree with. I completely agree with a lot of the sentiments of people who voted to leave.
yeah,
But
yeah, me
the
too.
but the end result was exactly what you described, and I'm not going to go. And I know you haven't either. I'm not going to go full on board and say that the regime wanted Brexit, but I think there's a case to be made for that. And the fact that one of the other things it did is that it captured and made complacent a lot of the discontent within the British population. That a lot of them felt it was a great success having Brexit carried out, and that they were finally out from under the thumb of Europe. But I mean, around 2018, I think it started to become obvious that it's either you're managed by the Americans via Brussels or you're managed by the Americans directly via Washington. And I think that we've seen the outcome of that. I know that there were some plans to try to uh, do the Kanzuk thing where they bring the Canadians and Australians and the New Zealanders
Yeah,
into
yeah.
into some sort of confederation, which I mean, just given the American influence in all the aforementioned countries, just wasn't going to happen. But I do think, and it also did bring back the ideas of British greatness, the idea that Britain could be an independent power once again that actually had a say on the world stage and wasn't just second fiddle to America at that point. But
Hmm.
I think what we've seen, and I think what was inevitable in retrospect, and I'll repeat once again, this isn't to disparage anyone who supported leaving the European Union or is anti-EU, because, like I said, I agree with all those sentiments and in principle and in theory. But I think what we ended up getting was a UK that was far more in line with the American empire in a much more direct sense. Whereas uh, you have some token statements of opposition from Macron every once in a while. Now those are fewer and fewer with each passing day, but there was still some avenue of at least formal resistance to the American empire.
Hmm.
But having removed itself from the European structure has, like I said, put it far more in line with the Americans. Now, funny enough, and as we're coming up on the eve of the European elections, those will be done by Sunday night, European time, or the time zones in Europe. All the voting will be done. It actually has shifted continental politics a bit more to the right. However, that has also come to the issue that there has been more compromise on the right, that you've seen a lot of right wing force on the continent that initially looked promising fall into compromise and fall into either that or just outright political persecution, as the case of the AFD in Germany. And like I said, what initially looked optimistic there ended up also being turned into a containment mechanism by the elites, and the ones that they couldn't contain, they just persecuted. So, and I'm not even saying all this to doom and gloom. I mean, there's a certain level of pessimism that's always going to be inherent with this, just because it's just the reality of the world we're living in. I'm not saying that just give up or anything. You can do what you see fit. I'm not responsible for your actions. I'll just say that off the bat. But it the the ability in which they were able to respond to this crisis and contain it was remarkable. Which I suppose, if you have any further comments on that, certainly. But that does lead us into some of the news about Trump lately.
Yeah, yeah, we should because I mean, I just think that it's an area where like that's the most useful Trump could have been, right? He gets Brexit done, and then, of course there isn't a consensus, a full consensus or unanimity about with Trump. I just think some elites understood the war footing. I certainly don't think Biden or his administration really understood that if they got elected in 2020, that they were maybe I'm being naive, but that they were supposed to introduce more sanctions on on China than Trump or any other previous president. Like it just, do you know what I mean? It just doesn't. I don't think they always know.
Biden, or more
And
appropriately his handlers, seemed like they were going to go back to the Obama era business as usual when they were actually hand selected for the ultimate escalation.
yeah, 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 yeah. And I do think that they have some sense. I don't think they have the full sense, and they also have to play to a public, that believes. Um, it's kind of like the example I brought up last time, where there's a governor. He's Roman. These guys are Gauls. They're misbehaving. At the end of the day, they'll tolerate if one of their own beats them instead of some foreigner. And this kind of works the same way. Like, yeah, it's shitty. We're closer to World War III than we were when Trump was in power, but it's okay. It's somehow okay.
We defeated orange fascism. How could we be dissatisfied with the outcome?
This is a perfect time to end civilization. We defeated fascism. What's that meme? 9,000 Fahrenheit can't melt. The last thing you say before it all blows.
uh, but but getting into Trump, that last week, it was actually, I believe, the day after we had recorded. I actually debated doing a special episode just covering that in particular. Trump was found guilty on all 34 counts, and he's to be
Oh
sentenced
yeah.
on July 11th. Now, these were related to just what were ultimately petty crimes that probably every man of almost every man of his wealth and power commits. Paying hush money, falsifying some real estate and tax records, stuff like that. Like I said, very uh, insignificant crimes in the grand scheme of things. In fact, the only reason these laws exist are to clamp down on elites who do go against the system. Because, of course,
Right.
if you're a rich elite and you do all of this, you're gonna either get some slap on the wrist or get away with it. But if you're too transgressive, and I'm not even saying Trump was that transgressive, but he was too transgressive for the powers that be, you get hit with those charges because they have those against you. And those laws almost exist as a blackmail on the elite. And
Hmm.
they certainly do their job. And you'll recall that actually they were threatening Musk to crack down on him with some sort of business code violations a couple years back when he bought Twitter over some of his labor law violations. Once again, those laws exist for that reason. They exist as a blackmail system for the elite. But Trump was found guilty on all 34 charges. He can face up to 4 years in prison, depending on the sentencing on July 11th. There was an initial outpour, of course, on the right for a lot of support for Trump. Naturally, and I understand the sentiments. And I mean, you know me, I've made my statement, I've made my position clear on this show many times before. Uh, I guess Trump should win because I don't know, he might have a few funny moments left in him. Definitely not going to recapture what we had in 2016, but
No, no way.
there's still some minor potential there, and he could still I don't know be enough of an annoyance to the people I don't like in order to make it worthwhile. And I
Mm,
mean, and what's the other option? Dementia Joe,
yeah.
who it might not even be alive by 2026. But like I said, I'm not going to get too far into direct election talk this episode, but more so focus on the actual charges against Trump. Now, there was an outpour of support for Trump. There were demonstrations. Nothing turned into violence. Nothing turned into petty street clashes that you even saw in 2016, 2017, 2018 until they really started to die down around 2019, 2020. But well, I mean 2020 excluding, of course, the summer of Floyd, the summer of love, whatever you want to call it. That's a completely different thing in and of itself. But what we saw with that is there of course was outrage. There were demonstrations about this, but it wasn't nearly as much as I thought it would be. Now, I think that's just due to the fact that his sentencing will be on July 11th, which is also going to coincide with the Republican National Convention. I'm sure that's no coincidence there. In which case, Trump is supposed to officially be nominated as the Republican nominee. And some people are wondering whether or not this is going to be able to shut down his campaign. Now, I don't think, at least perhaps I give them too much credit, that they're going to send Trump to prison just for the sake of political stability. I could see them putting some sort of sentence on him that hamstrings his campaigning. Perhaps, I mind you, these are the same people who gave, generally speaking, the same people who gave Alex Jones a an almost $1 billion fine for uh, comments he made on the internet.
Doesn't he
Frankly,
still have to pay that?
yeah, and it only gets worse. They only crack down more. They only try to seize more assets from him. So, like I said, don't underestimate the power of what financial penalty can do to these people. Because yeah, you could say, oh, Trump's rich and powerful; he can pay any fine. Well, I mean, like I said, they tried to nail Alex Jones, who doesn't have nearly as much money as Trump. Like I said, with the GDP of a small nation. So, don't underestimate the petty lengths these people are willing to go. Uh, but I think there's a number of outcomes where they can keep him out of prison so they can say, oh, we didn't jail a political opponent. Trump's still allowed to run, blah, blah, blah. But have some sort of penalty on there, whether it's financial, whether it's otherwise, that makes it nearly impossible to have him campaign. And I know the entire trial took place in New York, and I don't know how the New York legal system works or if this would be a possibility given the charge. And I'm no legal scholar here, but say I don't know he's put on some sort of probation that doesn't let him leave the state of New York. It's going to be very hard to campaign with that. Now I know there's other methods of campaigning.
Yeah.
He can do. He can have like television screen rallies where he gives speeches from uh, one of his penthouses to the people wherever, say like in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Idaho, or you get the point. But
Mhm.
in terms of him actually being able to get out, hit the campaign trail, travel around the country, and actually campaign for himself, there's a very real possibility if that's the case. And like I said, I'm not saying it necessarily is because I don't know enough about what penalties he could face in particular about this. But I do think that what is most likely if they're going. I mean, he's already been charged. It's a matter of what they're going to sentence him with. But what's most likely, it's going to be some sort of what is on the exterior slap on the wrist. But actually, once you dig into it, it's going to be something that makes it next to impossible for him to properly campaign.
Yeah, that's what it has to be, because there has to be some kind of plausible deniability of like a politicized courtroom, right? And um, if if he goes to jail, then it's too much of a banana republic. But if it just hampers his ability to campaign, and that's what allows him to, well, allows Biden to win, then there's a certain amount of plausible deniability, right? Because there's no other person that can run against Biden. Biden is just that good. Um,
And once again, also going to jail is too on the nose. But if you do put Trump under house arrest, for example, but I'm sorry, but if
I'm
you
sorry, I can't. It's just,
yeah,
it's just so the whole thing is so preposterous to civilization.
I mean that's a given number one. But but if they do some sort of middle of the road thing where they make it pretty much impossible for him to campaign, I think that's frankly more of a demoralization than throwing him in jail for 4 years. Because, like I
Yeah.
said, that's on the nose. That's the entire system's a sham. But you do this, it's like, oh, they were able to take down our guy. What's the point of any of this? Blah blah blah. And I'm not saying that he couldn't win under those circumstances, but like I said, they would be practically making it impossible for him to campaign in person. There's still stuff he could do. There's still people he could send out there on the campaign rally for him. I mean, we don't even know his running mate yet. That wouldn't be into the RNC. But once again, that also screws him at the RNC. And I don't know, maybe there's some sort of internal pressure on the Republican Party to disown him and put up some, I don't know, shield candidate like DeSantis. Who knows? That could be
Mm,
in the cards where they're leaning on the RNC saying, "Are you really going to run a convicted felon as your presidential candidate?" And of course, there's enough snakes within the apparatus of the Republican Party to say, "Oh, yes, of course," despite Trump's high approval rating among registered Republicans, which is I think still up into the 90s. But I, I I'm not saying it would happen, but I think there are conceivably enough snakes within the RNC to try to usurp Trump from the nomination.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he's just that good. So I mean, uh, that's right. I'm not laughing with you. I'm laughing at you. Um, uh, that's an inside joke. Anyhow, uh, so yeah, I don't. I see that as the more the safer route for them to take. I totally agree with you. Just hamper his ability to do this. Um, I don't know. I don't think people are as energized in 2024. The whole, oh my God, we're living under a fascist dictatorship. I mean, in many ways, Floyd obscured the whole COVID thing, right? Especially in its first year. And America was a special case because there were states that you know didn't have certain mandates that other states did, and that gave people a lot of faith in America. um I suppose, I don't know, the energy is not there. I think we've had 4 years to digest what happened under Trump, and this whole notion that if he had had a second term, he would have had more of a carte blanche to accomplish all kinds of things. And I'm not so sure, because it wasn't like he was going against Congress. He was going against a much larger, stronger, less detectable apparatus than, like, the political structure of the United States of America.
Yes, just the deep state for just
Yeah.
inexpedient term
Yes.
for it. I know that
Yeah.
that term has been beaten to the ground, but like I said, it's expedient. It gets point across you're trying to make. But yeah, I think that is the case, and that a lot of the energy doesn't exist. Even his most fervent supporters still have some bad taste in their mouth from the, let's just say, lackluster first term. Not that it wasn't without any benefit, but it left a lot to be desired. And I do think that under normal circumstances, some people might think with his second term, maybe giving him a second chance, we might be able to see some of that come to fruition. I know that there's, and I don't know, perhaps these people have a vested interest in being very optimistic about Trump. Perhaps they are just optimists by nature, which in which case I don't know what they're doing listening to the war report. I think that I can't. I'd be interested to meet that cross section of audience for the natural optimists who listen to this program. Um,
I'd love to meet some of the feds.
we're not that important.
You're right. You're right. What am I talking about? The hell?
Yeah, no, but but with that being said, I mean, I know that for a while their liberals were fear mongering about the whole Project 2025 thing, where they're going to have some great conservative revolution that sweeps through the bureaucracies and takes over, and America's going to be right wing fascist evil, which, like I said, is no different than what they said in 2016, which is no different than what they said in 2020. But they dug up some, I think it was Heritage Foundation document, was their smoking gun for the idea that America was doomed to right wing authoritarianism if Trump wins again. But uh, unless you want to believe that, which I have a hard time believing, then I think it's either Biden or lackluster Trump,
Mhm.
and maybe we get some bangers. Maybe he comes back to Twitter and gives us a few good ones. But uh, like I said, we can't get our hopes up too much about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Not that I'm saying we fall into complete despair, but I think a healthy dose of pessimism goes a long way.
Mhm. I agree.
But that is all I had, unless you had any last minute items to round us out.
No, no, that's about it for this week from me.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode of the War Report on this nice, I believe it'll be Saturday afternoon by the time this premiere is over. And we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.